Welcome to the For Peyton podcast. I'm Tammy Valentine, and this podcast is about mental health, real life, and the experiences that shape us. I created this podcast in memory of my son Peyton, known to many as Pete, who passed away in December of 2024. Whether you're here for insight, connection, or simply a deeper conversation, I'm just glad you're here. This is For Peyton. Welcome back to the For Peyton podcast. Today we have Stephen Hunzeker. He is the owner of Mountain Valley Mortuary. He's the vice president of the Colorado Funeral Directors Association, and he's the Rio Grande County coroner. Stephen, I'm just going to give you a minute to tell us a little bit about what life looks like for you. If we were to spend a day with you, what would that look like?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. This is such a neat honor. So a day in the life of Stephen Hunzeker, I think right now kind of revolves around my kids. Right now we're navigating summer basketball, summer football, summer softball, those kind of things. So I'm trying really hard to be present for my family, while also wearing kind of all these different hats and roles and responsibilities that I have to care for. I've been a funeral director in the Valley for probably close to 17, almost 18 years at this point. Recently, about 3 to build these relationships with families and those kind of things. So a normal day for me looks like getting to the office about 9 o'clock in the morning, going through paperwork, getting prepared for any families that we might meet with. It's interesting to know that funeral directors sometimes spend an hour, 2 hours getting prepared to meet with families before we even sit down with them for the first time. There's a lot of work that goes along behind the scenes that, families don't normally see.
Right.
And so a lot of times it's just getting prepared. I see a lot of value in pre-planning and education. And so a lot of my time during the day as well is spent talking with families about what pre-arranging looks like, why we do it, how we do it, how we do it responsibly, and how we make those decisions, at a time where we're able to think kind of level-headed rather than thinking emotionally driven. And so we spend a lot of time doing a lot of those kind of things. And then for me, evenings usually mean meetings or being involved somewhere in the community.
Yeah.
I'm part of the board for the Monte Vista Chamber of Commerce. I'm on the Optimistics board in Monte Vista, the Monte Vista Cemetery board. I like to be, that's one of the biggest things for me is I like to be involved.
Yeah.
Being a funeral director in a community is not just about being there when people need you. It's about being a part of the community. It's about, just being out and building those relationships. That in and of itself is so important. Over years, I've learned that families feel a lot more comfortable sitting across the table at a time of grief, loss, devastation, those hard emotions. It's a lot easier to sit across the table from somebody rather than somebody you've never met. There's a little bit of maybe comfort there. There's a little bit of trust that's already been built, and those things mean a lot to families when they're navigating such a difficult time.
Right.
So a lot of my mindset and how I grew up in the community in Western Nebraska that I grew up in, our funeral directors were always out, always in public, always, you knew them even if you maybe didn't. So that's kind of how a day looks. And then of course, in those evenings that I don't, I try and come over here and watch open field or watch some open gym and, support my kids in some of their athletic endeavors.
Yeah. Well, you're a very busy person, but I love that being out in the community. I think when you're going through a really difficult time, having a familiar face can make all the
Years ago, opened up Mountain Valley Mortuary and have had the opportunity to kind of serve families from where I'm at. And it's been an absolute honor, been an absolute privilege.
difference. It's like, all right, we have to go through this really hard thing, but this is somebody that I know that I've connected with before I'm in this hard place, and it really is important. So the few things we've been through when the coroner shows up and how they help and support the family, what a relief it is to see that, familiar face. So Yeah.
Yeah, when you're dealing with something so traumatic or, something that wasn't expected, I mean, having that individual come through the door that there's a relationship with
Right.
already, not saying by any means it makes it easier, but
Right.
I think that amount of comfort, at least knowing that individual is going to, take your person and handle them with care
Right.
and
Right.
dignity and respect, and you already know that.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
don't have to build that.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about how you got started in the business.
So when I went to college, of course, I was going to major in business and I was going to do, I guess the normal be a salesperson somewhere or do something. I don't know what I had in mind, but my initial major was just business management. And when my sophomore year of college hit, my dad called and said, "Hey, we're tired of paying for you all the time. And so it's time for you to get a job." And it just so happened my dad being a pastor knew one of the funeral directors in the town that I went to college in. And so there was a connection made, and I went in and interviewed for this job. And I remember telling my dad, "What are you thinking? I don't want to work in a funeral home." To me, that was just, it was not where my head was at that point in my life. And, so I started washing cars and vacuuming the chapel and just kind of cleaning, dusting here and there and those kind of things. As time passed, I became more involved. I was allowed to maybe sit and be with the family during a visitation, or
Mm-hmm.
I was allowed to go help with services in different
Yeah.
churches and experience some of what a funeral director does. As time passed, I became more interested in what was going on and opportunity to start meeting with families and sitting in with the funeral director as he met with families to kind of understand, what that looks like and how a funeral director actually helps a family navigate grief, loss,
Mm-hmm.
and then celebrating a loved one's life. I think the point that really sold it for me was that we would go to dinner. So every Saturday I worked a service, the owner would take me out to lunch. That
Oh, there
was
you
that
go.
was kind of an unwritten, just a perk of the job, I guess. But the thing that caught my attention was that people would go out of their way to come to the table to say, "Hey, thank you so much for what you did for our family." That relationship that's built is something that I don't think I can even express or explain sometimes.
Yeah.
But those relationships we build along the way are where that's the thing that keeps me coming back to funeral service. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what sold it. And then I started working at a funeral home in my hometown and ended up in Loveland, Colorado, and
Okay.
mortuary school. I did the funeral director portion of mortuary school in Houston, Texas, and then
Okay.
worked at a funeral home in Kerrville, Texas for a few years before I moved here. So,
Wow.
so a little bit of jumping around and starting a family in there and
Huh?
those kind of things
Uh-huh.
too. But
Right.
that's kind of what drew me.
In all of these years, what have you seen change the most in this field?
I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift back to families being more involved. That's one thing that I think I've seen, with social media, with a lot of these people that are out that talk about funeral service. They bring the realism back to where funeral service really is. I think we're starting to see that. I know in Colorado we've seen a big shift from traditional burial to cremation. That's
Mm-hmm.
a big shift that we've seen, that I think continues to shift a little bit more towards cremation.
Mm-hmm.
We live in such a beautiful area that families see a lot of value and appreciation in being able to have a loved one cremated and scatter the ashes somewhere
Right.
that's meaningful, a lake that we like to fish in or a trail we like to hike, those kind of things. So in Colorado, we've definitely seen a little bit of a shift towards cremation. The other thing I think that's really big for us right now, especially, is new licensing requirements that are going in for funeral directors. Colorado used to be the only state in the nation that didn't require licensing for funeral homes or funeral directors. There have been a lot of circumstances that have led up to where we're at now. So with those circumstances, unfortunate circumstances occurring, we've seen maybe a need for a little bit more oversight where funeral homes are related.
Yeah.
Or involved. And it's not to say in any way, shape, or form that funeral directors or funeral homes are not doing things right. 99.8% of us are handling the decedents that we hold in our care with respect and dignity and doing things the right way. But that 0.2% can make all the difference.
Right.
And so we're seeing a little bit of that shift. So where we were sunset for so many years, meaning that we didn't have licensing requirements, now we do. And now we're kind of dealing with the growing pains of how do we get to that point where we incorporate licensing, but we don't leave out some of the people that maybe weren't licensed originally and maybe grandfather them in and those kind of things. So there's a lot of different moving parts to a lot of that.
Right. Yeah. Where do you feel like people are like when they come in to meet with you, what do you feel like people are struggling with the most?
I think there's kind of a misconception that, when we go to the funeral home, we need to rush through things. We need to get things prepared. We need to move forward. I think that's one of the things that I guess I do notice a little bit. When families come in, hey, we have to have the service in 5 days, or we have to do some of these things, and we've got to move, and we've got to just move. And I think sometimes it's okay to take a breath and slow down a little bit. A lot of families that we have the opportunity to serve, we're navigating all these moving parts, trying to make sure that all the family can be here for the service, make sure that, everything's done and those kind of things. And, a good funeral home will take a lot of those responsibilities off the family's shoulders.
Right.
But I think we still have a tendency to try and do all these things in a short amount of time, So that I think is one of the initial things that I see as a funeral director is families come in and we're trying to rush to get everything, to move forward. And, it's important, I think, sometimes to understand it's okay to take a breath and slow down a little bit, The families that tend to wait 2 or 3 days are the families that tend to see maybe more people in the church for the service or, those kind of things. I mean, it's okay to slow down a little bit. And I think the other thing that we see is we don't grieve the same way. Cremation in some aspects, cremation to some people is basically just the easiest way to have a final disposition for a loved one. We go in, we sign a few papers, we fill out a death certificate, we have the body cremated, and we're done. We don't have to do anything. I think that's become not maybe more of a norm, but it is something that we're seeing a transition to. So we're maybe not having the viewing. We're not having the service. We're missing out on some of those opportunities for both community support and closure.
Yes.
I've had families that have come back years later and said, "Hey, I wish we would have viewed. I wish I would have had that opportunity for closure." And, sometimes again, we make those decisions quickly and we don't think about the long term of it, and so, and the service, you'll run into people at Safeway and for 3 months, people at Safeway are, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss." And they didn't have another opportunity to gather as a community to show that support to the family and, be in maybe a moment of prayer, a moment of reflection, celebrate the life through music, those kind of things. So
I feel like you said like a couple of really important things. I know when my son died, I internally felt like you feel disorganized and the anxiety's high. And so when I'm in that situation, I tend to work harder and faster. And so to walk into the funeral home and to have, whoever I'm working with, and in my case, they were great. Like I felt myself, my whole nervous system slow down and walk me through the process, because I think that you guys play a very crucial role in regulating something that maybe we don't have the ability to regulate ourselves. Like you provide that externally for what we can't do internally. And it's probably one of the most understated things that happens, because you go to a funeral home with a lot of anxiety and pressure and you're planning and you have a lot of decisions. But to walk in and to have someone meet you with calmness and quietness and like, it's okay, take your time. I watched when I took my dad to the funeral home to make decisions with my mom, just the way the funeral director there, he just was so calm and so patient. And again, it's that you guys help us regulate externally what we can't regulate internally. I'm curious, when we talk about cremation and viewing and services, what are you seeing in terms, or what do you see as helpful in terms of creating ritual and around death? Because that's very cultural. But I think sometimes when we don't have ritual, it doesn't give our grief a place to go, and those rituals do. But I'm curious how you're seeing that, and what's been some of the interesting things that you've seen and experienced in your work.
So, one of the most interesting things that I think I've experienced, and it's only something you're going to see in the San Luis Valley, and really more only in Crestone, Colorado. The Crestone End of Life Project is outdoor cremation. It's an outdoor pyre.
Okay.
It's very, very traditional in the sense of, how different areas of the world have cared for their loved ones. To us, though, it's a little bit unique.
Yeah.
The first time that I witnessed it, I'll be very honest, I was very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The second and third time, though, that I had the opportunity to be a part of just a very small part of that process, I started to see the value in it, the meaning in it, the taking the loss of a loved one kind of back to our roots of kind of where it started. In that sense, the family actually takes the loved one to their home. They dress and prepare and bathe the body. They hold the body a lot of times because of kind of the Buddhist background and some of those different religions that are in Crestone. They hold the body for 3 days. And then they go out and have the pyre ceremony. And it's very much, I think, what we envision. The loved one is placed on an expanded metal pyre. There's a cord of wood that's involved. There are pine branches and different things that cover the loved one. There's different essential oils and things that are used during that process. And then a family member traditionally lights the pyre. And the family stays in a moment of prayer or a moment of reflection or of celebration of the life until the time that process is complete. The family then receives what are called relics. So it's basically the remains that are returned to the family, and then the family can go out and do a burial or whatever they decide to do. That's a very unique thing that we see in the San Luis Valley, and we're the only area in the nation that has it.
Wow.
And so, where as a traditional funeral director, I used to think, man, that is really odd.
Yeah.
I've come to understand that there's really a neat place for that in the way that people grieve and the way that people are involved and those kind of things. I think that in and of itself kind of meets a need for a family who has the opportunity to do that and is wants to be involved in a process like that. Some people don't, and so that's fair as well. Another neat ritual that we see in the valley as well is the dressing of a loved one. I think that's something where we see that in a lot of our families here in the valley. Sometimes faith plays a part in that. Sometimes our church or religion plays a part in that. Sometimes we have families here that have, heard of other families that did it, wanted to do it. But I think that ability to spend time with our person, with our loved one, and to dress and prepare the loved one, prepare the hair, maybe do the
Yep.
There's healing in that.
There is. There
You
really
know,
is.
and that's certainly something neat that, I mean, all the places that I've been a funeral director, that was not something I saw very
Yeah.
often until I
Huh.
moved here.
That's
And so,
interesting. Yeah.
when I moved here and began assisting families, and that kind of became a little bit more normal, it was neat to be a part of that and
Yeah.
to, be there for families.
That was something that I was very, I don't know, it was very helpful for me. We were like, I was there when we dressed my son. Because for us in our religion, we like to dress them in their ceremonial clothing. Funny story, we got there and we forgot his white shirt. And so we're like, oh my gosh, we don't have a shirt. And my dad happened to have a white shirt on. So my dad took his shirt off and put his jacket back on. And so my son was actually dressed in my dad's shirt, had a missing button on the collar. But, anyway, my dad went home with just his jacket, no shirt on. So my son was buried in his grandpa's shirt. And then like with my mom, like being there and dressing her and, we had extended family there. One of my aunts helped with the makeup, and we just, my mom was very like hair, makeup. She always looked classy. And
You
so,
bet.
and in those moments, you have like those conversations about your loved one, and you laugh and you cry, and it's sacred and it's beautiful. And I can imagine the tradition and culture with Crestone, like it must be very much the same for them. Like there's something sacred and beautiful, and it's one last way to honor a loved one. And so I think ritual is such an important part of grief
It
and
is.
process. So, and I
Yeah.
love that you're so like open-minded and we're here. How can we help? And what do you need? Like, I think that that's so important.
Well, and I think, as a funeral director, it's important to meet people where they are.
Right,
I mean,
right,
mortuary school teaches us, how in the history of funeral service,
right.
accounting, a little bit of counseling. I mean, we get a little bit of those brief overviews. But I think the disservice that mortuary school does is it teaches us one way to do things. I mean, it's very much, these are the rules when we do a Catholic service. These are the rules when we do a Greek Orthodox service.
Uh-huh.
It teaches us kind of one way to do it. I think I've learned from experience and time that it's okay to be open-minded. It's okay to allow the family the ability to say, hey, I'd love to come in and paint my grandma's fingernails.
Right,
Where's there harm in that?
right,
There's not.
right.
And
Yeah,
so the ability to meet families where they are is something I think that makes us good funeral directors. I mean, there are funeral directors all over the place that'll just do it. We're going to do it cookie cutter the same way every time. It's the good funeral directors that take the time and the care to listen to a family's needs and be able to meet them where they are.
right,
You know.
right. Yeah. Well, just shifting gears a little bit, how do you see mental health showing up, one, for you in your role as a funeral director and in the lives of the people that you serve?
I've thought about this one actually a lot and a lot recently. One of the things that comes to mind to me is that as funeral directors, we put such a hard line on being perfect.
Mm,
We have one opportunity to serve this family to the best of our ability. And it is. And that's been my thought, has been, I look back at my career and I can remember vividly specific mistakes that I made. I mean, those are scars that I think I wear. And, I mean, to the point where sometimes it becomes anxiety. That's something that over the last couple of weeks, I think I've really taken a step back to think about. I think about a time years ago that I'm getting ready for a graveside service, and I drove by the cemetery and didn't see an open grave. And I went to the spot where the casket was to be buried, and there was a grave for an urn. I had not communicated well to the
oh,
cemetery that it was a full burial, not a set of
yeah.
cremated remains. And so we ended up setting the lowering device on top of an urn grave, having a graveside service, and I had to tell the family I made a mistake, or I didn't
Yeah.
communicate well enough.
Yeah.
And the hard part with that is that everything up to that point was beautiful and moving the
Right.
way that it
Right.
needed to, and then something like that happens,
Yeah.
and I'll tell you from experience, me personally, and maybe other funeral directors, I'm harder on myself than anybody can ever be on
Right.
me. I mean, I'm not perfect. And it's not, I didn't purposefully call and have a
Right.
little grave for a big casket,
Yes. Yeah.
but I think, a small one, I remember getting to a church really early on in my time as a funeral director, and I left the church truck, the rolling device that goes under the casket, I left it at the funeral home. So it just, we had to go back and get it. And, I mean, it's little things like that, but those times are times that I vividly remember,
Right. Right.
So I'm learning that, we're funeral directors and we're here to navigate with families at the most difficult times of their life
Right.
and be a part of celebrating their loved one or those kind of things. But we're not perfect
Right.
either. I
Right.
mean, we make mistakes, and that's been something that's really weighed heavy on me.
Right. Well, it's a lot, and the most challenging part has to be families don't always have the capacity in those moments to be patient and forgiving, and yet you're still showing up as a human who, can make mistakes, and sometimes families probably. And it's got to be really hard. You do so much emotional regulation. Like you're staying calm and present and available, but also like there's got to be some emotional weight that you're carrying. How do you deal with that when you're helping a family that's going through a really difficult time and it's also affecting you and it is someone that you know and your heart's breaking and you've got to regulate that?
Well, I can tell you, a lot of times I think funeral directors, maybe just me, I don't know if I'm speaking for the entire profession, but I know for me specifically, sometimes we get into those moments or we get into those arrangements where they're heavy.
Yeah.
They're they're a young child who passed away. They're a friend, a
Right.
longtime friend, that passed away. And sometimes it's just, escorting the family to the door at the close of the arrangement and sitting in the arrangement room and crying.
Right.
It definitely takes a toll. I think one of the things that I actually heard, a similar story in a TikTok not too long ago, and it really resonated with me. Again, mortuary school teaches us how to, work accounting and the history of funeral service, those kind of things. Um, they don't tell us how to talk to a family who just lost their 5-year-old.
Right.
They don't. We're not taught that,
Yeah.
and we do the best we can to help navigate and regulate emotion and be present for those families. We don't know what we're doing either some of
Right.
the
Right.
time,
Right.
I mean, that first time, I still vividly remember the first time I had to meet or I had the opportunity to meet with a family who'd lost a young child. I was at a loss for words.
Right.
I did my job. I really tried to wear that funeral director hat and be present for that family, but in the long run, I don't know that I really helped much because I didn't know what to say.
Right. Well,
You
and
know?
sometimes just words, there just aren't words.
Sure.
There just aren't when somebody's going through something. But what a weight that is to work in this industry and work with families, seeing them at the worst times of their life and having to process your own stuff. And yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's, for me, anxiety it played a big part in my younger years. I helped a family who had lost a child in a drowning incident, and that stuck with me in a very physical way.
Mm.
My wife, being the head coach of swimming at Adams State currently, has been a coach for years at Adams State in the assistant coach role and those kind
Huh?
of things. But my kids growing up spent a lot of time around the pool. And I remember the physical feeling of just my stomach knotting when my kids would be close to the pool. I didn't have a direct experience with that, but I worked with a family who did,
Right.
and I carried that. So it definitely is, there are a lot of parts of this that we carry with us,
Right.
recently losing a best friend. Yeah, that was probably one of the hardest moments of my life as a funeral
Right.
director, was getting that call that he passed and
Mm.
and everything, and then navigating with his wife, who was also a really good friend,
Right.
trying to support her where she was at and navigating. that
Right.
loss. It just becomes it weighs heavy.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that we don't always see that side of it, and there's a lot of, a lot of behind the scenes things that you have to carry and you have to work through, and at a certain point it's going to get personal, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be somebody that you know, somebody that you love. When I lost my son, I kind of knew what to do in terms of I'm pretty good at like difficult situations. I'm really clear-headed and I think clearly, but it was about a year later that I kind of fell apart. And I kept telling myself, like, I'm a therapist, I should know this. I just couldn't, I just struggled. I did finally go to therapy, and that was incredibly helpful, which you would have thought I would have done that sooner. But in those moments, it's hard to be human and be professional at the same time when it becomes really personal like that. And that's when everybody needs a little extra support and help, and people checking in on the people who are checking in on everybody else. And I don't think funeral directors get a lot of that. You show up and you play your part, and then the family goes on their way, and there's not always that, hey, how are you guys holding up in those moments? So yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think as funeral directors, we're used to being in the back of the room.
Right.
We
Right.
don't want to be, we're not there to be the center of attention.
Exactly.
That's
Right.
not our role. Our role is to navigate that loss with that family and make sure that they have the most healing experience that they can have while navigating such a difficult time.
Right. Right.
I think that one of the things that we do, and I know a lot of funeral directors do it, people don't see that we spend sometimes hours in a preparation room, whether that be embalming or preparing the body, or the time that we spend doing cosmetics or hair.
Right.
Believe it or not, a lot of us guys do that, but I don't think people understand that we don't just go back in that room for 10 to 15 minutes and then come
Mm.
out and, have a loved one in a casket that the family can view. Sometimes it's hours that we
Right.
spend. And it's a sacred time.
Yeah.
For us, it's a sacred time. I mean, we may or may not know that individual. We may have had past experiences, we may not have, but we might not know that person. But we've built a relationship with the family. We've spent tons of time listening to stories and hearing about that
Mhm.
person. And
Right.
in a sense, having just a small glimpse of getting to know who this person was.
Right.
And then the time that we spend in that sacred room of, doing the cosmetics, making sure that the part in the hair is on the right
Mhm.
side, or maybe the bangs are just right. I mean, those kind of things. It takes time to get to the point where when the family comes in, they look at their loved one and they say, man, he looks like he's sleeping.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it doesn't just happen. It's hours of work and hours of time spent, and for a lot of us, hours of being in that room saying your loved one's name. I mean, we talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, but that time for us is as sacred as it is the viewing time for the family.
Mm.
So there's a lot that goes into being prepared, and I think for a lot of us, for me included, sometimes spending that time in the preparation room in that sacred space and being able to prepare a loved one, that sometimes is healing for us too. I mean, and then when the final result is the family comes in and says, man, they look at peace,
Yes. Yeah.
that means the world to us.
I've I definitely felt that. Like, I remember walking in the room when it was time to dress our son, and first of all, they had pictures of our temples playing on the big screen, which was very meaningful. And then Peyton just looked, he had like a little smile, and there was so much healing in that. And now that you explain this whole process behind it, I guess maybe that's one of the steps I hadn't really considered until right now, honestly, like, but how meaningful that was to walk in and be like, oh, he looks like Pete. And same thing with my mom. We got to experience that, and she looked beautiful, and she did look at peace. And I guess maybe we kind of take for granted the work and the thought and the energy that you guys put in to preparing that for the
And
families.
and it's something that we do with love, we do with care. It's not something that we try and get thanked for.
Right, right.
It's just something that we do because it's the right thing to
Yeah,
do,
yeah,
you know?
yes.
So,
I've never in all of our working through things with, my nephew and my son and my mom. Yeah, I never experienced any funeral worker implying that they needed acknowledged or thanked or anything. And but they're just like, this is what we do and we show up. But through that you feel the love and the care and the compassion, even though they're behind the scenes, and even at the services they're very much, like you said, in the back of the room, but playing such a key role in making sure it all happens. One story about my mom that I was so impressed with, we didn't mention it at all before the funeral, but in the funeral, we talked about how my mom loved the Mannheim Steamrollers Christmas music. That was like her favorite thing. And she had lost her hearing years before she passed away and got cochlear implants, but she never could hear music again. After all those years of teaching music, it was her passion, everything. That was a big loss that she had in her life. But when it was time to leave the services to head to the cemetery, we stepped out of the church, and the gentleman who was driving the hearse, he had Mannheim Steamrollers just blaring. And it was such a touching tribute that he heard that, paid attention, and made it happen.
yeah.
Yeah, just
Yep.
very thoughtful, and so grateful that people are mindful of that.
Yeah.
What do you feel like families are struggling with the most? Families or individuals in this process, where do you see mental health showing up for them in the process?
I think that kind of as a society, I don't know that we know how to grieve. I don't know that we know how to navigate grief.
Yeah.
It's been interesting as I've been a part of some different groups and organizations that are trying to bring a little bit more awareness to grief and those kind of things. I think that we all navigate it in our own way. I think as a society, we've kind of become, well, a good example of this is, if you look at a family who's lost a loved one, a family that's lost a loved one, immediately there's a group of people that come together to help.
Right.
There's almost this immediate support system of people that just show up
Right.
and say,
Right.
where do you need us? What can we do?
Yeah.
And in some cases, they just do. They don't even ask. They just do. But we navigate those first couple of weeks, and a lot of times it's 2-3 weeks, and then all of a sudden everybody goes home.
Right.
And that, I think, is when a lot of families grieve the hardest.
Yes.
Because they're left alone. A widow that's left to grieve the loss of her husband after all 4 of the kids leave and go home, and they're scattered around the country. And nobody does it on purpose, but everybody has jobs to get back to, or
Right.
other things in their lives that they've got to return to, and sometimes leaving that sole individual to grieve in silence and not have the support that they need.
Yeah.
And I think, we're maybe a little lacking on resources for folks in the Valley.
I agree.
That's something I think that we're starting to see as we talk about different educational opportunities and grief counseling opportunities. We're lacking on a lot of that here.
Yeah.
We don't have access to maybe something that someone in Colorado Springs has access to,
Right.
or those kind of things. One interesting thing that kind of came up is I had a gentleman come in one day and talk to me about losing his wife. And he said, Stephen, when I go to Amazon, I love to read. He said, when I go to Amazon and look for books on husbands losing their wives, there's 1 or 2. When I go and look to see what it's like for a woman who lost their husband, there's hundreds of resources and books. And that actually became a discussion with Reverend Jason Cody. Jason actually, from a spiritual perspective, wrote a book about navigating death as a widower, as a man who lost his wife. So that's something neat in the Valley that's locally kind of come out of some of these conversations. Another conversation that's been had recently is maybe putting together some sort of a grief system or support system where men who lose their wives have the ability to maybe come in and learn how to cook a meal for themselves. I think, I've heard stories of when maybe the husband passed away, the wife didn't know how to handle the finances.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
when the wife passed away, the husband didn't know how to cook a meal. The
Right.
wife had done
Right.
it, their
Yeah.
entire marriage. And so there's definitely individual things that are needed at a time that a loved one is experiencing a loss. But I think in the grand scheme, there's a bigger picture there too that we're still trying to kind of figure out where we can fill gaps in to be able to
Right.
help families in that state
Yeah.
of loss.
In all of your community involvement, what resources are you familiar with in the Valley that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of?
That's the hard part. I know SLV Health has a group of counselors that are available to the community. I know you've done some amazing things, and especially in the aspect of grief. But really, there's not a whole lot. I think a couple of local churches have had grief groups that they've started. I don't know if any are currently going on at this point, but
Yeah.
I know that they kind of come and go from time to
Right.
time. I think, but I think getting the word out to people is the issue. I
Right.
don't think people know that some of these things are going on.
Yes. Yeah.
That these opportunities are present.
Right.
So I think that becomes a little bit of a challenge getting that out to people. But I know that there are resources in the Valley. We just need to do a better job of putting those resources together and making them available to people. And again, meeting people where they're at in their grief.
Right.
There's not a cookie cutter way to navigate grief. It's different for everybody.
Right. Right.
Hospice does a really neat thing. It's called the Death Cafe. The Death Cafe actually came from Europe, and it was kind of it was designed by an individual as an opportunity for people to gather around tea or coffee and to just talk about their experiences with loss, with death, with funeral homes. I mean, it's kind of just it's an all-encompassing conversation, and
Right. I love
there's
that.
really no right or wrong conversation. There's no direct, hey, we're going to talk about this today. It really is more of a let's gather, let's put a bunch of questions in a jar. We'll pull the question and then we'll have a conversation about it.
I love that.
Hospice does that once a month. I think it's on the first Friday of every month. But that's been a neat opportunity. I've been able to attend a few. And it's amazing to sit and listen to people talk from where they're at and have some deep philosophical conversations, have some kind of funny conversation. One came up, can you put a hat on a loved one in a casket? That was one of the conversations. And it brought up a lot of neat topics.
Right.
I mean, what kind of hat does that mean? And what do you do if you put a cowboy hat on? You cut the back off. It really brought up some neat conversations. But for other opportunities, it's, maybe someone will ask, what do you do when you walk into their bedroom? And you feel this weight of sadness. How do you navigate that? And so other people have the opportunity to say, hey, when I feel that, maybe, she was an artist. So I go to the table and I color a picture or I paint a picture. People have the opportunity, though, to share their experiences with a group of others that may take some of that and maybe use that to aid in their grief.
Yeah.
So it really is kind of a neat opportunity.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I know you and I met at the Celebrating Aging conference. I was there to present on grief. There were a lot of, so I think the more that conference we get the word out on that every year, I think that helps a lot of people navigate everything.
That's been absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
When that started, it was a board of just a couple of us, and we really hoped for 50 people. That was the hope, was 50 people. The first year we did it, 200 showed up and 30 different resources. This year we think we had close to 300 in attendance off and on throughout the day. And 38 different resources showed up.
It was I was so impressed with it. I just think that's something I would love to be a part of every year because I'm just like, this is such a good thing.
It is.
And it was really meaningful having, just watched my dad navigate everything with the loss of my mom. Everything. There's the funeral and the services, but then there's my My mom's retirement ended when she passed, and my dad's been a rancher, so there wasn't like PERA or anything like that. So trying to help him navigate Social Security and, food security and all of these things at this age. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is a complicated process. And so I love that there were so many good workshops for people to get that kind of help. Tried to get my dad to come with me. He was a little stubborn about it, but
Sure.
my goodness, I think in fact, I learned a lot. And I came home and told my husband, like, we need to be thinking about these things. Like, we're not as young as we think we are. We should be planning. And so it was great.
I
It's
think
such a great thing.
we put on the flyer 55 and up or something, I think is
Right.
what we put in. And I'm thinking, man, I'm going to be 47 this year. I'm not too far
Right.
away,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, it is. And even the interactive workshops that we had, the chair yoga, the physical therapists that were there to talk about
Yes.
what we can do to decrease fall risk.
Yeah.
There was just so much there that hopefully brings a community together in support of our aging population, and then just brings resources together to help our aging population navigate
Right.
some of those challenges. I tell you what, there are a lot of things that I'm honored to be a part of, but that's got to be one of the biggest.
Yeah,
I don't know.
a neat
It's
thing.
one of those things we get close to May, and I'm so excited for that conference.
Yeah, it's a
It
good one.
just is the what it brings to our community is
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, it was impressive. So, couple of just different questions. What do you do for self-care, and what is like your strangest self-care habit?
So, I'm going to say this, and my wife's going to watch this and go, "Oh, Stephen." But for me, I think one of the ways that I self-care is service to others. I think that we talk about love languages. That's something Melinda and I have talked about a little bit, but that service aspect, that is one of my love languages. I'm not good at it at home, but I'm good at it everywhere else.
Yeah.
So that's why she's probably going to say something. But that really is something that I do for self-care. I love giving back to the community that supports us. I love running the clock at the Centauri basketball tournament. I love being able to sponsor different events. I love being able to be a part of our community. That sometimes is what takes some of that weight away for me.
Right.
Other things that I love to go out and shoot a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Here and there. I don't get to do it often, but I do really enjoy that. So I love to travel. I love to just hop in the car and get out of the valley.
Yes.
We just fixed our 2000 Jeep Wrangler, so
Oh,
I'm really
nice.
excited to take that in the mountains and go drive around a little bit and those kind
Yeah.
of things. So those are some self-care things that I do. I think probably the craziest one is I'm 47 years old and I still like to play video games sometimes.
That's awesome.
That is a way that I kind of relieve some of the weight and those kind of things. So I remember being younger and thinking, man, I'm never going to be that guy that plays video games at 47, but I am. So I don't get to do it often, but when I do, it's usually playing NCAA football and Nebraska's winning the national championship.
There you go. There you go. That's perfect. I love that. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, what advice would you have for a family who has never been through a process like this? They've lost a loved one. What advice would you give them in terms of working with a funeral home in making arrangements? Because that was like uncharted territory for us when we went through this. We didn't know, just didn't know what to expect or anything. What advice, I guess, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and financially would you have for families that all of a sudden find themselves in that situation?
I think the biggest piece of advice I would have is it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to, if you don't understand or you don't know what your options are, it's okay to ask questions. A good funeral director will really appreciate those questions because not only are they serving your family, but it gives us the ability to know what your needs are and where we can meet those needs. So I think really, and also what's required, what's not. There's a lot of thoughts that like embalming is required all the time. It's not. So, have those conversations, ask those questions. And when I walk through an arrangement with a family, I lead the conversation for the most part, but at the same time, I leave it open for questions to be asked. And I tell families at the start of any arrangement, if you have a question, interrupt me. I'd rather answer the question and give you some at least something to think about, then miss it and move on. I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways is, it's okay to ask questions. You don't have to let the funeral director lead everything. Learn and understand what your needs are, because every
Right.
family's needs are different, and we don't know unless we're guided
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
The other thing we talked about earlier, slow down. Take the time to process everything. If you want the service in 3 days, maybe think about waiting another 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Give yourself time. There's a lot of things that we can do as a funeral home to help prepare for those services and those kind of things. But the family has a lot of things that they're trying to navigate too.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's okay to slow the process down a little bit.
Yeah.
We've had services, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of slowing down this much, but we've had services that we've waited 2 or 3 weeks to
Yeah.
have the traditional service and
Mm-hmm.
those kind of things. Those take a little bit more communication. There's
Right.
some aspects of that as a funeral director, as we guide the family or walk with the family, there's maybe some honest conversations that happen
Right.
along the way. There may be some things that change. There may be some things that we need to adjust.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if it accommodates your family, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's ultimately what we're there for. On the financial side, I understand a lot of times that families come in and we want the absolute best for our mom, or we want the best for our dad. It's okay to simplify a little bit. We can still honor a loved one and cut the cost of the service a little bit. I've told families in the past, it's going into debt over a funeral is not going to help grief. In fact, it's probably going to compound it,
Right.
because
Right.
not only are you dealing with the loss of someone so significant in your life, but now you're getting a bill from the funeral home every month.
Yeah.
It's so it's okay to navigate within our means.
Right.
And it's okay to honor a loved one's life within some of those parameters.
Right.
We, as funeral directors, we love to find those aspects of honoring life, celebrating a loved one's life through whatever means we can.
Yeah.
I mean, just because we didn't select a copper casket doesn't mean that we can't have a beautiful graveside service.
Right. Exactly.
There are wood caskets. There are other opportunities that are less expensive that are still just as beautiful. So
Yeah.
it's one of those things. And funeral directors kind of get that bad rap sometimes, that there are some funeral directors that take advantage of you during a difficult time. Again, I think that goes back to ask questions.
Yeah.
Get an understanding of what your needs are. The funeral director will learn that too, and then we can kind of find a place to do that. And the questions, I mean, if you have a loved one who's maybe entering hospice care, or maybe navigating towards the end of our life, or if you're just 65 and you want to just take that opportunity to have some of those things prepared for our kids, so they don't have to worry about it. Pre-arranging and pre-planning is a great way to sit down where there's no external pressures. You're able to have honest dialogue and look at all the options without having emotion be a part of a driving factor in what we're doing. So, and then from my perspective as a funeral director, when we take the time to provide that gift to our family, it makes that process so much easier when the time comes, because a lot of times the funeral director walks in with a fully completed file and we sit down and we review the death certificate. We maybe talk about the obituary a little bit. Maybe some things have changed that. And really the final question is, when do we want to have the service?
Right.
Everything else is decided.
Yeah.
You know, we know what hymns we want to have sung at the service.
Right.
We know what songs we want to have played. We know who we want to officiate, or, you know, who the pallbearers are. You know, some of those questions, as small as they are, can cause big stress in a family.
They really can. Trying to put all those pieces together, there's a lot to it. And, yeah, I think, you know, it was helpful for us. We were given a form and said, this is kind of the information we need. And then we went home and like, okay, we can get all this together. So that was helpful. It's funny when you talk about simplifying. When we went to pick out the headstone for my son's grave, I had all these ideas. You know, I wanted all the things on this headstone.
Yep.
And I was anxious. I was like anxious and emotional going into that little shop. We went to this place in Springs, and it, you know, it's just like this little simple shop. The couple have been in this industry for years. Obviously, it's seen a lot of people like me. And I'm just going and I'm like, well, what about this? Or we could put this and we could put, you know, and I had all this anxious energy. And finally, the guy just kind of put his hand on the table and he said, Tammy, sometimes we just say more by saying less. And he's all, let's just keep it simple. And I was like, you're right. And you know what? We simplified everything, and the headstone is perfect. It has exactly what we want on it. It was the way we wanted it to be. But I just needed somebody to stop that spiral.
Yep.
And tell me it's okay to simplify. It's okay to slow down. You don't have to do all this at once and have all the things, because I'm like that was like my one last like piece of, I guess, closing that chapter was getting that headstone. So I'm like, this is my last way to honor him. I want all the things on it. And I was grateful that there was somebody to kind of regulate and simplify and walk me through that. And he wasn't there like, you know, it's expensive. Headstones are expensive, but he helped us. And by the time we did that, it was way more affordable than everything I wanted. So he wasn't there to like take advantage of me. They were able to do it in like on a timeline. They said, we can have this ready to go at this date. And if you're waiting years for a headstone, you don't get that last piece put in place. And I know it takes time. Like it was months for us to get that, but to go. And then, you know, that was another part of, all the family came out and we went and set the headstone. And then it's just been a week ago. Today we went and set my mom's headstone.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah. And that was like a good time for the family together and remember. And then, you know, we went and had hamburgers at my brother's house. And so, yeah, I think, but I love that you emphasize the importance of just simplify and think through it. And sometimes we say more by saying less.
Yeah, that's right.
So just to kind of wrap things up, is there anything, like what would you really want listeners to know and understand from our conversation?
You know, I think as I've pondered this over the last couple of weeks, you know, remember that funeral directors are human too. You know, we're not perfect. We do the absolute best we can for every family that we navigate this time with, you know, but we're human. You know, we do make mistakes. We do cry. We do wear some of this weight. You know, one of the things I've noticed about me personally is I remember faces. I'm really bad with names a lot of the times, but I remember faces. And I'm amazed sometimes that going into Walmart, I can walk down an aisle and see someone and I can immediately have that connection with that person because I remember their loved one. I remember the circumstances sometimes. I remember, I mean, there are a lot of things that, you know, before they even recognize me, a lot of times I recognize them. And you know, but I think to just be aware of your grief, you know, where you're at and understand it's okay to cry at the moments that maybe you don't think you should, or it's okay to maybe have a belly laugh when you remember something funny. It's okay to have those moments. We all navigate grief so differently, and we need to be able to meet people where they are in grief. And as an individual that's grieving, we need to understand it's okay to grieve. It's okay to have those emotions. You know, because we're human, and you know, if we don't let those emotions out and we bottle them up, it doesn't serve a positive purpose for anybody. You know. So I think maybe those are two things that I would point out.
I love that. I love that. If there's one thing I'm learning, grief is a continuation of the relationship that we have with the person that we lost. And so it really, your grief is between you and that person. You know, with my son, I have that mother-son relationship with him, so my grief is going to look like that. And that's our relationship, and it continues even after his death. His wife had a different relationship, and that's her grief is between her and him. And so we experience the relationship differently, so we're going to experience the grief differently. And so we don't have to be comparative or performative with our grief. It's how we maintain that relationship. So yeah. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything that you would want to remind or share or plug or anything that you have going on or in the works or you see in the community?
Sure. Do keep in mind the lunch and learns that we do in collaboration with SLV Health and the CSU Extension. We've got some neat programs coming up. It's the first Tuesday of the month. It's at what used to be at the Grizzly Motel in Alamosa, right on the highway. SLV Health kind of bought that little building, and so there's some meeting rooms in there. We provide lunch, and we just have the opportunity to sit down with attorneys, real estate agents, kind of a continuation of the aging conference.
Yeah.
We're kind of trying to bring some of those presenters in to talk a little bit more about some of those topics. So that's definitely something that we're currently doing. We talked about the aging conference. So next May, the first Friday in May, just first or second Friday in May, just keep that open. It's going to be a neat event again. Otherwise, yeah, just an honor to be here, and it's been a pleasure. So.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's been such a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for spending time with me on the For Peyton podcast. My hope is that this conversation gave you something to think about, something to carry with you, or maybe a reminder that you're not alone. If you'd like to go deeper, you'll find companion episodes and related digital downloads for each topic at valentinecounseling.org. This will help you continue reflecting, learning, and applying what resonates. Until next time, for Pete's sake, take care of yourself and each other. This is for Peyton.